We're now encouraging women to find their emancipation in things that we know don't make humans happy, like career, like consumerism. And then we're confused why they're not happy.
Everything is structured to encourage women to forget that they're women.
It's funny because everyone's so shocked by OnlyFans, and OnlyFans is the extreme, but girls today sell themselves all the time like products. I don't think we have a generation of just selfish, entitled young people. I think they have actually not been taught morality, and now it's the individual girl setting her own boundaries and having to defend them to someone.
Our guest today is Freya India, an up-and-coming young writer in her 20s whose many writings on Substack, and in particular her vital new book, Girls, Generation Z and the Commodification of Everything, charts the commodification of growing up itself and the challenges facing young women today and therefore young men today as well. Freya and I talk about the shallow conceptions of freedom that liberalism offers, freedom as raw choice, as opposed to the freedom to do what we ought to do, the freedom to do the sorts of things that are conducive to human flourishing. We talk also about the triumph of the therapeutic and the risks of treating ordinary human experiences as pathologies that should be medicalized or treated by therapists. And we talk towards the end about what solutions there might be for young women to find their way back to a life of authenticity, of resilience, of hope. Welcome to First Light. Freya India, in the space of a few short months, you have become, I think, the voice of a generation on so many issues, but particularly those neuralgic issues that people on both the left and the right just are nervous to talk about, don't know how to talk about. Tell us a little bit about, first of all, that journey, how you got to be that voice, how you sort of stumbled into the wilderness and were able to just stand back and think something's gone wrong here.
I think stumbled is the perfect word, because I didn't come into it through intellect. And I feel like a lot of conservatives come at things through intellect. And I actually felt that was missing when I started writing about these things. But I actually found myself writing about it just through feeling, which was I felt very anxious, very out of place. And I was kind of looking around at other girls thinking, are you feeling the same as me? And not really seeing that. And a lot of young women would talk about pain from modern things, so family breakdown or social media or modern dating, but then kind of stumble on what we should do next or why this was happening. So I honestly just started writing because I felt so bad and I was trying to stumble through it. And then I found myself in this kind of conservative world just through my own kind of instincts. And now I'm trying to articulate that feeling because I feel like, conservatives don't really speak that language sometimes.
One of the essays of yours that made a real impression on me was for First Things magazine, based in New York, the Journal of Religion and Public Affairs. And in it, you argue that the right has lost touch with feeling, has lost touch with sentiment. There's a well-known figure on the right in America called Ben Shapiro, and he has this signature line, facts don't care about your feelings. Yeah. And he's surely right about that. But it's also the case that feelings don't care about your facts.
Yeah.
And maybe, part of the story of the dialogue of the deaf that is emerging in the public square at the moment is that a lot of the positions that we reach are through feeling, and that people just don't really care about facts.
Yeah, I think Ben Shapiro encouraged some people to think, never argue with emotion. So if you argue with emotion, that's a fallacy, and obviously there's truth in that. But if you're talking about emotional things, so if you're talking about divorce or pornography or things that conservatives really care about. They're things to do with the heart and the soul. And if you argue them through statistics, people don't feel anything. So I was kind of writing as a young girl, kind of like doing a blog, really explaining this is how I feel. And I felt that really not only touched conservatives a lot more, but brought people who were more progressive over to see the conservative point of view more, that they have more empathy for it, because I'm explaining how I got to those instincts rather than saying these are the logical, rational arguments and you're deluded. It's more that I feel this way and I'm looking around and this seems to be the only solution.
One of the stories that's often told about why it is that there's this sort of dialogue of the death between the sexes and this sort of war between the sexes, and it's a fairly standard story on the right, that feminism, particularly second wave and third wave feminism, confused equality with sameness.
Yeah.
The idea that for person A to be equal to person B is to person A to resemble in all respects and in all opportunities, access to social goods, person B. So that for a man to be equal to a woman, for women to be properly emancipated into the sunlit uplands of equality, so really for women to have everything that men could have. And so, and the difficulty there is that just there are objective differences between men and women, differences that can and should be celebrated and that we've just kind of forgotten about.
Yeah.
Is that your sense that that's something that both the left and the right have been pretty much oblivious to?
I also feel there's something strange going on now where in that pursuit of sameness, we demonized men, so toxic masculinity, the idea that being traditionally masculine was bad. So we have this kind of caricature of men, which would be aggressive and sexually promiscuous and all of these things. But those are the exact traits we now praise women for. So if young women are aggressive and they put their career first and, they're sexually promiscuous, now that's empowerment. And I think that's where the confusion comes from, is that young girls are growing up they're being told that to be a strong woman, you have to resemble a man. But then at the same time, they're being told, open up and share your feelings, but also be this strong woman who doesn't care. And I think it just gets confusing. And that's probably where a lot of the confusion around gender comes from and how they should be feeling, because the cultural message is inherently confusing.
Yeah. One of the most sort of troubling features of the sort of empirical landscape over the last 50 years that I find is that despite the hard-won and entirely legitimate victories that feminism has won, from certainly in Britain from the early 1970s onwards, with the Equal Pay Act, 1970, the Sex Discrimination Act, 1975, and so on, is this sort of uncomfortable reality that when we measure psychological well-being, very difficult thing to measure, of course, and self-reported data is always very tricky to handle, but the broad picture seems to be that despite those great moments of emancipation over the last 50 years, these enormous strides forward in female equality, women have been getting steadily less happy. In some circumstances, really, really miserable. And how does one understand that?
Well, I think about what Christopher Lasch wrote about. So he was talking about after the Industrial Revolution, we had this haven in a heartless world. So the family kind of constricted. And because the world was getting more competitive and capitalism was getting more aggressive and, you had to go into this really cold environment, it kind of narrowed down. And then we had this idea that women need to be emancipated to join where men are in the cold, aggressive, competitive world. And I think that's what happened, is that we thought that would be liberation. And that didn't necessarily make men happy. And I think this is the issue, is that we're now encouraging women to find their emancipation in things that we know don't make humans happy, like career, like consumerism. And then we're confused why they're not happy. So I think that was the issue. The issue wasn't that women were staying home with their families necessarily. It's that it constricted so much. And, at that time, religion started to fall away, community started to disappear, neighborhoods started going. That puts so much pressure on staying at home to the point where going to work in that competitive environment did seem liberating. But I don't think that's liberating for men either, to have this really competitive cold world and your one refuge is at home. We need to build up more in society for everybody to feel happier.
Mm-hmm. And this was a problem on both the extreme left and the extreme right. I mean, if you think of those, think of the Soviet Union in the 1920s pushing hard International Women's Day, making widespread access to abortion not just permitted but actively encouraged. The drive there from kind of the Soviet communism is for women to get out into the factories and for all workers to be, as it were, to be sort of sex blind when it came to factory work and labor. And then on the right, with the forces of unbridled capitalism, the idea is that, yes, women have got to get out into the workplace and we've got to be looking at the GDP and making sure that it keeps going up.
Yeah.
And it's a sort of something that both sides of the Cold War and both iterations of both descendants of left and right from the Cold War have not got right at all. I mean, I remember somebody saying the other day that, we don't want to go back to the 1950s. Wouldn't it be better if we went back to the 1750s?
Yeah.
That is to say, a pre-industrial world in which men and women, women are queen of their households, but they're also, overseeing large families, working the land, and as it were, in the family is a kind of micro community with no commuting and no soulless office spaces. It's probably a little bit of a little mischievous as a suggestion, but something happened with the Industrial Revolution, and it gets reinforced with the forces of capitalism on the one hand and Marxist-Leninism on the other.
I think that period, the 1950s, was an aberration. That's not actually tradition. If you look through history, it was very unusual to restrict the family that much. But I think about that all the time. When you look at feminism now, when you look at female empowerment, it's always companies trying to find ways to turn women into better consumers or better workers. So I was reading the other day about Snapchat, I think, and another company are now sending breast that you can, if you're a woman, you can go on a business trip and send your breast milk home. And this was like their female empowerment campaign, and it's good for women. And when you actually sit back and think about it, it's literally taking away every limitation, so you'll be the most productive worker. And there's also things like they have creches in offices now. I think there's companies that do these robot cribs that they give their employees so they don't have to look after their baby as much. And that's empowering.
Right. Everything is structured to encourage women to forget that they're women.
Yeah.
Or to forget those sort of anchoring moments in their underlying biological reality.
And I would think that would be bad if it was for men as well. If there was, strategies to get men to focus solely on career, not see their children, limit that time, I would think that was also bad.
I mean, one way one might push back against what you're saying is to say, well, yes, tech has made life very, very difficult and soulless, and it's forced women to forget that they're women, and maybe men to forget that they're men. But tech has also opened up all kinds of possibilities. I mean, I look at you and the career that you are embarking on at the moment, and your own trajectory, and strikes me, I mean, you're unusual, of course, but you've managed to develop and forge a career as a writer through digital platforms. You've managed to use technology very, very, very subtly and very effectively.
Yeah.
Do you think that that's a positive phenomenon that might become a little bit more expansive, that more opportunities might open up in the future for people maybe not as talented as you, but who've got skills that could allow them to, pretend that it's the 1750s.
Yeah. Oh, definitely.
And look after the kids, not leave home, and still feel fulfilled professionally.
Yeah. I think Mary Harrington talks about this, that if you want to be a young mum who's looking after a toddler, then technology is great because you can have a career where you're just looking at your laptop every now and again. And it provides, it goes back to before the 1950s where you can actually work from the home. So I'm not anti-tech in that sense, but I think there has to be lines drawn. So for me, I try to separate commodification of my work. So I'll work online, but I won't commodify myself as much as is possible. So things like sharing your writing on Substack, I think is great. But I think posting selfies on Instagram is not great.
Sharing your private life on Facebook or wherever.
Essentially, when you are the product.
Yeah.
And there's an element of that with personal branding. But I try to avoid that as much as possible where it's my writing first. You know, I won't post selfies. I won't tell people what I'm doing. I won't market my life or my memories. And Mary Harrington talks about that as well, having this, she calls it digital modesty. And so I think tech can be great if you're able to have those boundaries. And I think the problem is we're not teaching, especially my generation, did not have those boundaries because nobody knew what it was.
Mm. One of the things you write about so brilliantly in your new book, but also in your Substack essays and elsewhere, is the way in which technology has just really quite literally commodified women. It's encouraged young girls to think of themselves as commodities to be sold online and frame that as emancipation. You talk about TikTok, you talk about, I think it's face tuning, and of course we've seen the horrifying rise of the phenomenon of effectively online prostitution from the privacy of your own bedroom. Companies like OnlyFans, this sort of grotesque, sort of diabolical enterprise that began, to our shame, in Britain, as far as I understand. And indeed, in some corners, that of the world, that's being celebrated. I saw a headline in The Economist the other day that said that, maybe one of these OnlyFans creators who's doing unbelievably well, as it were, maybe this is just good for the economy. Look at all the revenue that OnlyFans brings home. As I said, sort of grotesque. And it's if the House magazine of Western liberalism, The Economist, is effectively celebrating the economic opportunities that commoditizing women in the most horrifying way possible. If that's what they're cheering on, what hope is there?
Yeah, it's funny because everyone's so shocked by OnlyFans, and OnlyFans is the extreme, it's the obvious form of commodification. But girls today sell themselves all the time like products. So to them, OnlyFans is not extreme. It's just making money off what they're already doing. So
it's a difference of degree rather than,
if you got Instagram when you were 12 and you started posting selfies, and then by the time you were 16, you'd been on it for a few years, and gradually you'd made those pictures more suggestive because you're trying to get attention of your crush or the boys you like at school, you're competing with other girls online, that gradually escalates and escalates. OnlyFans is not a big jump from that. In fact, it makes sense because you're then monetizing something you were doing for free. And I think that's what I'm trying to get across in the book, is that girls are products now. So they're selling themselves on Instagram, they're advertising themselves like objects on dating apps to be shopped through. They're turning themselves into personal brands. I think it's over 70% of Gen Z want to be influencers now. And so commodification is life to them. They don't know an existence without marketing themselves at the same time. And I think OnlyFans is the one that shocks people because it's quite literally selling your body. But the actual act of marketing yourself like a product is just their daily life.
Mm-hmm. And what can we do about this, if anything? Clearly the state has a role to play. Law is a great teacher. And, criminalizing is a sort of, I think, a good conservative insight that, we have laws on the books, maybe knowing that very often people will not comply with them or the police won't be good at enforcing them. But the fact they're on the books is society expressing a message about what are the proper parameters of human dignity and offenses to human dignity. Maybe society surely has a role to play too.
Yeah.
But what are the means? How do we tackle this? If you were in charge for a couple of weeks, what would you do?
Well, there's a lot of complications with it, which I don't know the legal ins and outs. But to me, having ID verification on social media, or especially porn sites, to be able to get onto OnlyFans, to be able to get onto Pornhub, you should have to show some identification that you're not 12. If you want to start an Instagram account now, you just put in a different year and you can create it.
But does that go far enough? I mean, shouldn't a company as evil as Pornhub be shut down? Shouldn't it just be, and shouldn't OnlyFans simply be shut down?
Well, I agree, but it's so difficult.
I know that in certain states in the US, I think they've made some progress here. And
there's a petition, I think 2 million people signed it in the US to get Pornhub shut down. I think...
of course, the thing about the internet and the digital world, well, generally, I mean, how does one enforce any laws that are applicable to a single jurisdiction when you're dealing with, by its very nature, a global space? I think the solution now, because I don't think we're going to get to a legal solution anytime soon, but the solution now is just, as Jonathan Haidt says, not to let your children on social media. And I think to be really firm about that, I have so many people push back on me with so many caveats and reasons why it's acceptable. People saying that their child is lonely, so they depend on Instagram, or they just give them the iPad now and then. And I used to be quite, cautious about saying just get your children off social media. But the more I've written about it, and after finishing this book, I just think not having your children near these devices, I think it is doable, and it is kind of the only solution. What I don't think is a solution, which is a lot of people advocate for, is, so now there's this thing, digital literacy, which is like, we'll teach young people to use social media in a healthy way, or we'll teach them to limit or have these screen time apps. That does not work. If you're 14, the point is you can't limit yourself. And it's so easy for children to get around these things. So I think I often read these books that are just horrifying descriptions of social media. And then I get to the conclusion, and the solution is, manage your screen time. And so I wanted to write a book which was deleting the apps is the only answer. And I think, young girls don't realize you can live without Instagram. It's completely possible. They just can't conceive of it. And the state might have a role to play. I mean, yes, of course, just because, you're not allowed to buy cigarettes under the age of 16, or you can't go to the pub and have a drink under the age of 18, doesn't mean that under 16-year-olds won't be buying a packet of cigarettes and so on. But it's really setting the kind of the moral parameters of society, setting out a kind of an ideal vision.
Talking about it, because I think conservatives sometimes have an issue with agency. So if I write about how horrific some of these things are, I'll often get responses from conservatives saying, it's victimhood, or, you've got individual responsibility. Or even things like, these women deserve it because they voted for feminism. And I'm talking about like 14-year-olds now. And I think conservatives can really get obsessed with individual responsibility to the point where they can't see the wider culture. They can't see that if you're a young girl growing up now, this is the only world you've ever known. You've never known life without Instagram or a smartphone. You can't conceive of acting differently to this. And so that's what I'm trying to do for conservatives, is to write actually the story of how we got here and why young people think like this. Because I think that really helps. I don't think you can solve a problem without comprehending it. And so I think we have to face the worst of it in order to move on.
I wonder if you think part of the problem is that conservatives have just been sipping for too long at the kind of Kool-Aid bottle of liberalism, and the idea is that freedom is not just important, it's the most important thing, which is really in the DNA of liberalism, when in fact, traditionally at least, conservatives have had seen freedom as vital and absolutely crucial, but they've seen freedom more in the sense of having the freedom that to do what you ought to do, rather than just the freedom to choose whatever you can do.
Yeah.
And that freedom in the classical conservative tradition has always been understood as more of a fruit that is a fruit that emerges from the kind of the roots of order, and that order comes not from the state but from faith, from flourishing families, from a happy city, a happy neighborhood, a happy community, a physical community, not a confected online community, and even a nation that is at ease with itself. And I wonder, all of those are under attack in different ways. Faith is under attack in lots of ways, a kind of skepticism, secular skepticism about Christianity in particular, skepticism about the family, it's about the individual, and there are all kinds of different ways of having a family nowadays, it is said, and nationhood, my goodness, to be a sort of nationalist is, it's effectively the other N word, you can't go anywhere near it. So it's almost as if all of the things that used to make freedom ordered and fruitful have been taken away, so that all that's left is this kind of raw freedom, and that's what the right pushes for, and it leads to disaster.
Well, that is the point, all that's left. And I think young girls and boys, but girls are growing up in the rubble of everything that's already disappeared. And it's not like we knew it and it's disappeared. It's not like, I never knew a time where religion wasn't mocked or just taken as self-evident to be wrong, especially where I grew up. That was just how it was. I've never known neighbours. I've never had a neighbourhood. I've never had a community. And, I'm going through some of my memories for this book, for, going through my girlhood. So much of it is online, and it's funny, I finished this book and a lot of it was written from my memories growing up in Essex, England. And I spoke to some young girls in America and they said, oh, I remember this and this and this, because it's all online. So we had the same childhood. And I think this is kind of what older conservatives miss, is that they say things like, why are young people acting this way? Why don't they want to settle down? Why don't they value meaningful relationships? Why are young women selling themselves online? But you can't wish we were different if you don't face the consequences of what was already done. So, young people growing up watching graphic porn are not going to be good spouses. They haven't learned to be loyal or selfless. And it's funny because we talk a lot about, I think most people accept that young people didn't have the social opportunities to be confident. So we didn't have as much real life interaction. So we're more socially awkward. We spent more time on screens. But also we didn't have the communities to learn selflessness and kindness. And, we didn't really have any obligations to other people. I certainly didn't have religious responsibilities. I didn't have neighbours to look out for. I didn't have a stable family. So I think a lot of people in my generation are reaching their 20s, getting into a serious relationship or trying to be a better person and learning it all for the first time, learning it themselves. And that's kind of what I want to get across to people is I don't think we have a generation of just selfish, entitled young people. I think they have actually not been taught morality in the same way that previous generations were taught. Think of my grandparents. Their life revolved around other people. We're told now, put yourself first above everyone. And it's hard to, rewire that.
I mean, one of the great challenges is that we've sort of lost the moral language, the moral grammar to state the distinction between right and wrong, between what's a valuable form of life and what's a less valuable form of life. There's a kind of, even though we all really know, our moral intuitions are pretty accurate, there is this sense, and maybe this comes from liberalism, maybe I'm being unfair, but a sense that, whatever your conception of the good and the good life and whether God has got anything to do with it or not, should be privatized. It should be domesticated. It's not something that you can bring to bear in the public square. It's really, religion and talk about morality is really something only for consenting adults behind closed doors.
Yeah.
And so that we just don't have any way of talking about when we're confronted, for example, by that Economist headline that I mentioned earlier. I look at it and think this is hellish. This is just morally horrific and repugnant. But if and I've said words to that effect in other situations, but you could feel the sort of, gosh, why are you condemning this entrepreneurial young woman who simply has a different conception of what the good life is from you?
Yeah.
And I feel that sort of, who am I to say that?
I think.
So how would we recover that language? And
I think that's really sad. I think young people were really deprived of that language. And, for example, if you felt sad about your parents' divorce, traumatized by your parents' divorce, what language did you really have? Because, it's really difficult to talk about things without sounding backward and reactionary.
You should be happy for the newfound freedom that your mum and dad have found in their own journeys, on their own pursuits of finding themselves, and even if it means losing you.
Yeah, and that happens with so many issues, and I think it's actually very dangerous for young girls because they've been taught morality as being non-judgmental and nice. And so they can get in a situation, say they get into a bad relationship or a guy is expecting things of them, that we would judge as horrific and unfair. And they have been left without the language. They don't want to, referring to things like what's right and wrong, referring to commitment even. If you say, as soon as we start dating, I don't want you to date multiple people at the same time. What happens now is the person with the stronger moral instinct is the insecure one. So if you have an issue with, your partner being more, sexually permissive, or your partner's expecting something of you, or they're not offering you commitment, or they're watching porn, anything you're uncomfortable with, you are then the controlling, insecure person in this world where we all have our own private morality. And it goes back to women thinking they need to be strong and empowered. But that often looks like saying nothing. It often looks like, I'll put up with that and be fine with it. And I grew up with that version of morality, which is just, everyone has their own universe. and
that is really the liberal solution, well-motivated liberal solution. I mean, as it emerges in the 17th and 18th century, the idea is, the way to avoid another terrible war of religion is just not to talk about these vital but fundamental questions, not because they're not vital, but because they are. And we might, we want to keep the lid on it. And but as that's mutated into the 20th century and the 21st century, it means that we are effectively struck dumb. When it comes to expressing ourselves or expressing any kind of moral judgment.
Yeah, and it puts so much pressure on the individual girl. So we have this thing now of setting boundaries. You've probably heard of. It's like a therapy term. And I think boundaries has replaced the word morals. So we don't talk about moral character. We talk about setting boundaries. So if you meet a partner, it's not about finding out, it's not about your values, your virtue. It's about, if I don't like this behavior, I'll cut them off or draw a line. But what happened was a progressive movement kicked down every societal boundary we already had up. And now it's the individual girl setting her own boundaries and having to defend them to someone. So she's having to stumble around saying, I don't like you being addicted to porn because it makes me feel insecure. She can't talk about, loyalty or monogamy or God. All of these things can just be dismissed. And so you're putting so much pressure on girls, boys as well, but girls to the point where there's nothing they can really defend themselves with. And I see that so much. I see young women having so many issues in relationships or getting stuck in these situationships where there's no commitment. And all they can really say is, that's his way of doing things. They can't say this is wrong. Why as a society do we keep allowing this to happen?
I'd never thought of that before, but I just think that's so insightful. The idea that language of boundaries or personal sort of fiefdoms of subjective consent and choice has replaced the older language of a broadly shared set of moral norms and conventions. And I think what that creates is effectively it catalyzes a complete paralysis between the sexes, because it means that every boy is not going to know how that particular girl where those boundaries have been fixed, and no doubt aware of the consequences of breaching the boundaries that thought might have been boundaries, is rather going to just prefer to stay in his basement and watch pornography and play video games than take the risk of breaching a boundary that he has no way of knowing where it might lie.
Well, now you find out, where someone lives, what their job is, and then you find out their version of right and wrong. Right. And I feel what we do now for young people is we tell them everything to walk away from. So as a young woman, everything I heard growing up was walk away, don't put up with it. That was the empowered version of being a woman. We never taught young women how to stay, to focus on sticking with things, committing, men as well. But I feel like the women's message recently has always been walk away from things. And it's the same with morality. We get told walk away from behavior you don't like, never what to walk toward, what you actually stand for or actions you're looking for. And I think, this is the issue, is we haven't taught a generation virtue and morality. We've just taught them, cut off people you don't like. It, like an accessory, find one that fits.
One of the corners of society where I do actually see less of these problems than elsewhere is in the churches.
Yeah.
And by churches, I mean not just any church. It's tends to be committed churches. It could be very evangelical, Puritan-style churches. It could be very traditional Catholic churches or Orthodox communities. And there's still this sense that you are part of a community. Marriage matters. Sex matters a lot more than the sexual revolution really believed. That this is, the sexual revolution did not take sex seriously enough, and that's why sex is the final casualty of the sexual revolution. And some of the language I hear some young Christian friends use, I've got thinking of 2 or 3 friends, young, strapping Christian lads in their mid-20s, and they're very sort of self-conscious about the fact that they refuse to date.
Yeah.
They say, we don't date, we court.
Yeah.
And what they do is they'll step out with the young lady, take her to dinner, go for a walk, and they'll do that for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, and then they'll decide, do I think that this is the woman for the rest of my life or not? And quite quickly they make that decision. 2 months, 3 months, I don't know. And then they just say, and they ensure that it's a chaste relationship. And then they say, after 2 to 3 months, not this isn't working out, but I don't think we're going to get married.
Yeah.
But it's a good thing for you to get married, and so you shouldn't be wasting your time with me.
Yeah.
And you should find somebody who's going to be really right for you.
Yeah.
Now, this is when I tell this to some of my secular friends, they just think these young guys are mad.
Yeah.
But it seems, this is courtship. This is the older way of doing things. Okay, it may be very difficult to do, and maybe you need to be formed in the right kind of communities and families. But it seems to me that no religious community is perfect. But it seems to me that a lot of the really thriving churches get that right pretty much, and they've got the right structure, sort of distinction between celebrating conformity to norms that are good for you, they're going to conducive to your flourishing, and stigmatizing behaviors, not expelling people from the church if they've been found to not conform to the moral code, but just looking down and seeing that this is not a good thing. It's not a good thing for you. It's not a good thing for the community. It's something we are going to just have a view on, and it's a negative view.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because that system works through limits. your freedom is limited. So you court someone, you don't move in with them, you can't date around at the same time. There's an expectation of a limit on your freedom. And I think for the young women I speak to, they have real pain from the excess of freedom now. So they will all have stories of people, cheating on them or just dating people at the same time, just this kind of confusion of what level the commitment's at. So they'll have all these heartbreaking stories, but then if you suggest any limits on freedom, that's, too restrictive, that's just unthinkable. And I think this is where we get into an issue because, I see all the same problems they do. There's a lot of liberal young women talking about the dating crisis the same as me. They're talking about the pain and the heartbreak and everything. But where we diverge is, I actually think freedom is found in limitation and devotion to someone. And I actually think keeping your options open to everyone causes so much anxiety because there's so many paths to take. There's so many ways to turn. There's not only so many people you could date, but so many variations of how you could date them. You could move in straight away. You could, see multiple people at the same time. You can have an open relationship. And I think a lot of young people think freedom equals happiness, and it really doesn't. And the more you narrow your life down, that's where actual freedom is found, I think.
It's an incredibly subversive idea, isn't it, in our liberal age, that is to say, in an age which prizes freedom above all else and sees freedom, maybe also equality, as sort of upstream of everything else, when it does seem as if many of the classical virtues have some idea of limit or constraint baked into them. If I'm, loyal to my football club, that means, I am chaste with respect to other football clubs, and, I'm going to impose limits on myself. If I'm going to be humble, humility is an exercise in putting constraints and limits on one's view of oneself. And but it's such a troubling idea for the liberal mind that not only is freedom and liberation compatible with limitation, but in fact, limitation is often the enabling condition of freedom. Yeah. I often tell my undergraduates when I try to getting this point across, the reason I'm here today in the lecture hall is because I drove here today, and I drove here today because I was able to drive here today because there was free-flowing traffic in the centre of Cambridge. And the reason there was free-flowing traffic is that there's this thing called the Road Traffic Act 1988, which pretty much everyone is going to comply with. There's the Highway Code, there's conventions around laws around roundabouts and zebra crossings, and everybody which side of the road to drive on. Yeah. The incredibly complex web of rules and regulations and codes and conventions. And I don't say, gosh, I had such an oppressive time getting to the faculty this morning. I just really felt the weight of the Road Traffic Act 1988. No, and thank God for those things, because it was those limitations that enabled liberation. It enabled me to not even think about getting to the faculty in 6 or 7 minutes. But this is such a difficult idea for the modern mind to wrap itself around.
It's counterintuitive, and I think it's quite cruel what we teach young people now, because we celebrate the end result. So for example, if someone's been married for 50 years, everyone finds that admirable. Liberals find that admirable. I know a lot of liberal young women who, I tell them about my grandparents who've been married 60 years and they think it's beautiful and amazing. And other commitments, if you devote yourself to a work project and you finish it to completion, people admire that. So we admire the milestone, but we discourage everything that it takes to get there. So, if a young couple meet in their 20s and they're ready to commit and they know they want each other, we'll help them search for problems and red flags, and we'll worry about them. And yet, if they made it all that way, we'd all be at the party celebrating. And I actually have noticed in recent years, I think it's now the parents of Gen Z discourage early commitment. And I don't know, I'm trying to figure out why that is. I think some of it is divorce rates and, trauma from their own marriages breaking down. But I've heard from a lot of my friends, young women in their early 20s, that they got engaged or they met someone and they were sure, and their parents panicked, and their parents are never protective, and they became protective about commitment. And now the fear is that, not that your child won't find someone or anything like that, the fear is they will be naive and do something too young.
They won't settle down, they won't cohabit, they won't, as it were, try out the goods.
Yeah, that's safer.
When all the data is pretty clear, as far as I understand it, that people who cohabit before marriage are statistically more likely to divorce or to break up.
But we're in a situation now where, like, young women are having to break the news to their parents that they're engaged, which is just a complete reversal of before. And, I do see some signs that younger people are almost rebelling against their parents by going the other way.
So tell me more about this Zoomer-boomer dynamic, this idea that maybe the kind of established norms and conventions, which, as far as I can understand it, among boomers is to defy all conventions, defy all norms, that's the only norm that should be obeyed. And there's always been something, obviously, about young people that want to be countercultural, that finds authenticity in challenging what the norms of their parents. And so could it be that, to be trad, to be more conservative, to try to live out a life that, boomers would have remembered in their parents, perhaps, is something that we'll see more and more of?
I think so. I think Gen Z will be split. So you'll have people who go the complete opposite way, and then people who will become more conservative.
Will there be a sort of, don't want to really talk about it in this reductive way, but a kind of Darwinian process whereby, it's those people who recognize that norms and conventions and limits are actually conducive to human flourishing, conducive to family flourishing, that will...
Yeah, I think they'll have very different outcomes.
And would you start to see, do you think, a kind of social inequality? I mean, we know our mutual friend Rob Henderson talks a lot about luxury beliefs. And, is there a worry that it's really only the sort of maybe the middle class Zoomers who will be waking up to just how damaging those luxury beliefs really are? Yeah. And as it were, you'll start to see that it's among the kind of the working classes where none of these ideas really started. Yeah. They started at kind of with the elites. But the real sort of social devastation impact will be, the really negative impact will be among those who can least afford the consequences.
Potentially, but my experience has actually been that it's middle class people that are overthinking these things. Yeah. So things like having children. Yeah. Really.
Yes, it's always Tarquin and Jocasta who are gluing themselves to the M25 because of some crazy eco.
And they're doing the pros and cons of having children and really turning it into like this logical thing rather than just an instinct.
A lot of education can be a very dangerous thing. It can make you very, very stupid.
I've seen a lot of that. But I think in general what will happen with Gen Z is, so they look at their parents or boomers, and there's a lot of devastation there of marriages, of families. And I think for older generations, I'm generalizing, but in my experience, they seem to believe that the solution is more freedom and individualism. So, we got divorced, all our friends got divorced, which means you shouldn't marry young. You should be more free, you should try people out. And I think young people have watched the consequences of that. And I am seeing people, myself included, trying to go the other way now, where maybe individualism is not the answer. Maybe we're seeing such high divorce rates because people were not committed enough. And because of individualism. And so I think actually you will see an almost rebellious side to Gen Z where they'll just take these things more seriously. And I think the assumption is to think, so many marriages end, let's take marriage less seriously, and it's actually the opposite.
Right.
And I hope that's what happens, but I do think a lot of young people have been left with severe anxiety, insecurity about relationships. fear of abandonment that will potentially stop them from taking that risk. But I'm trying to encourage in my writing to take that risk and, rather than hiding away from these things, to go all in and try even harder.
Well, one of the things you're so good at, Freya, in your writing is describing that kind of anxiety, because it always feels very raw, it feels very real, feels as if you've had a taste of it. And I think that's why you're becoming this sort of spokesperson for your generation. And one of the wonderful chapters in your new book is just called simply Diagnosed. Each chapter's got one word, and I know you've written about this elsewhere because I've seen a piece or two about this, the mental health industrial complex, you might say, and this tendency in the modern world to overdiagnose, overlabel, redescribe ordinary feelings of anxiety or distress that are totally normal parts of human existence, and pathologizing them and giving them an acronym, and worse, attaching a medication, not medicine, a medication to treat symptoms because we're just too agnostic about whether there might be some genuine human problem here that's to be dealt with, as opposed to some sort of neurological condition accompanied by some urban myth about serotonin uptake or chemical imbalance. And you've written so well about that, and how actually pathologizing these ordinary forms of human experience is disempowering, because once you've got that 3-letter acronym, you've got it. And the message is you've just got to live with it. There's no way out.
Well, you're a product with a label instead of a human.
And I wonder if how does one shift that? Obviously, there are enormous corporate interests among big pharma to not let the status quo change at all. But maybe it's also because of what we were talking about earlier, about this sort of enforced, coerced agnosticism, about using normative language, moral language, a moral grammar, about what's good, what's flourishing, what's a good example of a human being's life being well lived. This is sort of bread and butter Aristotle. All the classical philosophers talk about this. They take it for granted that there is basically one way for human beings to flourish. There might be different skills or different kinds of life through which they flourish, but there was no real disagreement about what a flourishing person looked like. And it's almost as if we can't use that language. The only language we can use is the language of science. And so we've got to filter everything through this sort of basically pseudoscientific prism of pathology, when that's always going to be wrong, because we are animals, but we are so much more than that. We are minded, conscious beings who very plausibly have souls. And you don't need to be religious to believe in souls. Plato and Aristotle believed in souls. You don't have to be. But that seems so kind of primal, the idea that we are subjects, that we're not ultimately just reducible to our animal nature. And yet, I suppose the reign of science has meant, or the dominance of science as the kind of benchmark of what counts as true and real, means that we can only really make sense of ultimately what human nature and human flourishing is just in these sort of strange, weird, medicalized ways. Yeah. But say more about that. I mean, what do you think the way to sort of approach that? I don't want to use another medical metaphor of antidote, but I mean, what are the antidotes and antibodies to this tendency to just pathologize everything?
Well, I think you kind of hinted at it, which is to find your own words, human words for things. And it goes back to what we were talking about before. When we lost the language to describe things, so for example, if you're anxious about your relationship and you feel like you don't have the language to express that, the really tragic thing is now we'll likely diagnose that young girl. So, if she is in a situationship where she's not getting...
Situationship. I've not heard that word before. This is a new word to describe just something that we can't really attach the word relationship to, but okay.
You fell into a situation and you don't have the language or permission to ask where it's going or what it is. A lot of people end up in this scenario. So you're in a situation like that and you don't have the words to describe what's going on. You feel very anxious all the time. You go on TikTok and you're told these are symptoms of an anxiety disorder or attachment disorder, then you can have young girls going down the path thinking there's something wrong with them, again, because of their moral instinct is alerting them to something. And so I actually think this therapy culture is one of the most cruel and dangerous social contagions for young women, especially because it encourages you to ignore what's happening in your life, medicalize yourself, pathologize yourself.
You've got a kind of pharmaceutical broom that allows you to pretend that you can just push all this under the carpet and brush it all under the carpet.
And then you are the problem. And I've seen it happen so many times when I've been researching for the book and other things. So there's a Reddit forum where young people talk about porn, the anxiety of their partners watching porn, how they feel about it. There was one post where a young girl, she's maybe 15, starts talking about how her boyfriend is addicted to it. She writes out this kind of heartbreaking story about how she doesn't feel enough. All of the comments are, this sounds like a you problem. You might have anxiety. I think you have an anxiety disorder. And this is my issue with it, is that now that we all live in our own worlds with our own morality, you can then say to people that, you know, your version of morality is actually just a disorder. So if you're a conservative, you know, like me, I'd be, you know, my security in a relationship, what I view as acceptable, will be different from someone who's a liberal young woman, and mine might just get medicalized as you're really insecure or controlling or anxious. So that's my...
And this is a standard method of totalitarian regimes down the decades, you know, that disagreement is pathologized. If you're not on board with the regime, you know, there's something wrong with you. It's not that you could possibly be possibly right. You're not even wrong. You're ill.
And it's, if you go online, it's got to the extent where there's no such thing as personalities anymore for young women. There's just symptoms and disorders. So there's no character traits, you know, there's no selfless people, there's just people pleasers. There's no, you know, loving people who wear their hearts on their sleeves. There's just the anxiously attached, codependent people. You know, there's no hard workers. There's just like the traumatized people who are chasing ambition. You know, everything has a pathology. And for young women, I really do think it's elevated to resemble a religion and a new kind of faith, where their entire worldview is this therapeutic worldview.
And the therapist's couch is the priest's confessional. And there are certain sort of liturgies of wellness, mindfulness, self-care. And it's just this extraordinary, I think, fraudulent cottage industry where, you know, you can go and see a therapist for 20 years trying to solve all your problems, and at the end, after thousands and thousands of pounds and thousands of hours, you realize that you just needed to accept yourself for who you really were. And it's just a complete fraud, because we're not just animals. We have minds, we have souls, we have subjectivity, and these in the end are not ever going to be the objects of any kind of scientific or pseudoscientific inquiry.
And especially if you're an adolescent girl, you're going to be emotional and sensitive. You know, you're going to struggle with body image and insecurity, and these companies are so intrusive. So when I was researching for that chapter, I was looking at BetterHelp, which is one of the biggest, you know, online therapy platforms. And then I start getting bombarded with BetterHelp videos. And their therapists now, you text them. You don't have to call them. You can just text 24/7. So it's not even
all of them. I notice. I mean, there's a huge variety in different schools of therapy. A lot of them are completely conflicting in their view of what might have gone wrong or how to put it right. And so even if they are, you know, if a science emerged 120 years ago like psychology and psychotherapy, and, you know, we found that 120 years later, they're all 4 or 5 different schools. and 5 or 6 different schools of physics with all completely radically different and mutually incompatible ways of addressing this supposed object of scientific inquiry. You'd think there's something wrong with this science. I mean, it's not actually,
that's a good point.
And I sometimes think, psychology, psychotherapy, I know they're not quite the same, but, they've had more than 100 years to show the world how you're a science, how the mind is in fact the brain. And it just doesn't seem they've managed to do that.
And also the problem now is what we were talking about before is each therapist has their own moral universe, their own right and wrong. Mm-hmm. So if you went to a therapist and you said, my boyfriend wants an open relationship and I feel uncomfortable about it. If the therapist thinks that's okay, that's just another choice. She might encourage you to try it out. She might not say to you,
or imply that there's something wrong with you if you resist.
Yeah, what happened in your childhood?
Maybe it's some deep trauma. I'm not sure you should see your mum and dad at Christmas without reminding them of this terrible trauma that was inflicted on you at
the solution
2 because they went on a skiing holiday without you.
The solution is always to blame your mum and dad.
Yeah, right.
But I think that's a huge issue with it, is that, you might be occupying a completely different moral universe to this person. And I try to show through my writing that if you feel a certain way about something, there's not necessarily something wrong with you. And I think that's a really important message, especially for girls, because you'll feel all kinds of ways when you're that age. And there's so many predatory influencers, companies that are literally saying to girls, if you feel anxious about exams, if you feel nervous about going on a first date, you need this anxiety medication or intervention from a therapist. And quite literally every young girl could be diagnosed with a disorder.
Freya, we've been talking about an incredible range of issues. They've not been very cheery issues for obvious reasons. And it's time we faced up to just how painful and difficult lives of young women today really are, especially for people like me on the right, and for whom your writings and the writings of a few others, a small handful of others, just have opened up this incredible glimpse into that world of pain. If you're not a digital native like me, it's a very alien and foreign world, and just think you've got such a unique perspective and voice. And what I think, so despite the doom and gloom, I just want to end, as we like to on this podcast, with a question to you about are there signs of hope? I mean, what is it that kind of quickens your pulse, that makes you think, in the end, I think we're going to get through this, if anything?
Well, I did a talk at Unheard recently about Is Romance Dead? And we went through all the bleak topics, so like porn and dating apps and everything. And N.S. Lyons, he watched it and we were talking about it, and we were both saying something has shifted, because it felt like that there were a couple of people on the panel, and I was obviously giving this really bleak perspective. And sometimes other people on the panel or in the audience would kind of talk sarcastically about these things, or ironically. And that used to be the way we talk about things. So if you brought up something like online porn or divorce, you kind of laugh at it, be sarcastic, you just kind of have this ironic distance from it. And N.S. Lyons said, which I thought was really interesting, is there seems to be a shift toward sincerity now. And there were a lot of young men there who spoke so clearly and from a really vulnerable place, and they were just honest about how they felt. And there was no kind of hiding their feelings. And I see that with young women more and more, where they're not pretending to be a product or a strong, independent woman. They're just being human and saying, actually, I find this really painful. And I've seen that in response to my writing as well. And so what gives me hope is I think we're moving from an age of irony to sincerity. And I hope that continues, where, as we were saying before, people don't talk in therapy speak, and they don't they just use their own words and their own language to describe what's going on, and they have the bravery to do it.
Well, that's something to hope for. And if we do see that phenomenon develop more and more, it'll be in no small part thanks to your work and your marvelous book. Freya India, thank you for joining First Light.